YouTube? Hyckory Styck back with you. We are back to work on this Calcutta 250. In the last video, we dismantled it and got it ready to be cleaned up. I will link that video in the description of this video. But it's cleaned up now. There was nothing wrong with this reel that I could find. The bearings were good. Everything was good on it. However, I did find out that when Shimano designed this reel, apparently on the spool, they used this plastic bushing. Now, why they did that is beyond my comprehension. But it is possible to upgrade to a bearing on there. The bearing that fits on there is a 5x11x3. I talked to my guy, and that's what he wanted to do. We're upgrading this to a ceramic bearing. Also, the two other spool bearings, which there was nothing wrong with. While we were in there, we upgraded these to ceramic also. So we're going to reassemble it and grease it and get it back into the state of fishing and ready to go. This is not a particularly complicated reel. It does have quite a few small bits and pieces, as you can see, but it's not a real complicated reel. So in that case, we're going to get started putting it back together, and we're going to start with the spool and the new bearing on the spool. Now, this bearing does not have an orientation. It slides on the spool right there. And then we've got the bearing, the spool pin. And the pin, it does not matter which way this pin goes in. It is the same size on either side. The pin will push in to a certain point and then it stops, and we're going to use this handy pin pusher. I bought this from Spool Speed along with the bearings. Now, this thing has two sides. It has a pin side and a flat side. This will be your uninstalling side, your pushing side to push the pin out, and this will be your side to reinstall the pin. So we are going to screw it in till we meet the pin, and then we are going to let it catch and bind up, and we're going to start pushing the pin. And there's really no index on this pin to know how far it goes, so I'm going to have to eyeball it, and I went a little too far. I'm going to have to measure it out. It looks about even. Let's put the calipers on it. 6.43, 6.44. That's actually very close. We're going to leave it there. I eyeballed that closer than I thought I would be able to. I'm going to test fit it on the pinion. See that we've got about equal protrusion on the pinion, and we do. Next up, we are going to install the level wind. Now, the level wind has several pieces that go together at once here. Your hood, you've got your shaft, you've got your actual guide bushing, you have your other level wind bushing, spacer washer, and then you've got your C-clip, and it is the biggest C-clip of them all. Okay, so now we're going to put the level wind together. The level wind hood, the opening in the hood points down. So you're going to put the opening in. Then you're going to put your line guide on. Your line guide, the flat side of your line guide goes to the inside of the reel. Next thing you're going to want to do is put on your gear side bushing, and it slips in. It is notched. Now you want to slide in your level wind gear. Now that you've got your level wind gear slid in, you're going to slide this back so you can actually get some access. And you're going to take your palming side bushing and you're going to go on with it. It goes in like that. It sits in just like that. Then you will take your washer, set your washer on, kind of line your washer up. I know y'all can't really see from this angle. Then you're going to take your clip, and we're going to put our clip on. And I've got this pair of needle nose that I'm going to use to put the clip on. Once you've got the clip on, now you can slide the entire assembly into the hole across from on the far side. Now make sure when you go in with this hood, the hood actually goes into the hole also, along with the bushing. Now you can put in your guide pin, and there are 2 guide pins. One of them has a turn down section on one end, the other one has a turn down section on both ends. You want the one that has the turn down section on both ends, because one of the ends goes through the hole in the keeper plate, and it's the smaller end. So when you install this guide pin, you're going to put it with the smaller end towards the gear. It slides in, it drops into its hole on the far side, and just leaves the tip of it protruding up a little bit. Now you got your keeper plate. The way the keeper plate is made, as you can see, you've got this little stepped portion. The stepped portion is going to step up and go on to the little ledge built into the bushing of the level wind, and then it also sits down onto the guide rod. Then you've got a little small screw, a little short machine screw that goes in to hold it in place. Big headed screw. Now hold some pressure on the little keeper plate, and you ain't got to bear down on it. Now we can install our pawl and our pawl cover and our bushing. Now keep in mind, you have a gear driving this one, and then you have that being driven by this gear. So you've got this main gear, and you've got an idler gear, both driving this thing right here, your level wind. So when you're reeling your reel, your level wind is spinning the same direction as your handle. So therefore, if you look at it and you spin it the same direction your handle, your pawl, the wear is going to be on the outside of the reel. So you want to look at your pawl and see if you got wear here. And this one does have some wear, and we're going to turn the pawl around so that the worn side is to the inside of the reel. To get the pawl seated, there we go. Now we've got the little pawl spacer, which is that tiny little washer, and it's going to go in there, and then you've got your pawl cap that's going to go on. Next thing we want to install is going to be our bearing on the inside of the housing, on the palming side. As typical of any reel, you have a tension washer that goes in first down into the bearing hole. See, now we've got one of our bearings. And by the way, these bearings are 3x10x4. Then we have our bearing retainer clip, and I'm going to spread it just a little because it's got years of wear on it. And we're going to install the bearing retainer clip. There we go. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this end of the level wind. Now we can put our cover plate on this side, because that's all that's on the inside of this reel. Now we're going to put the name up, make sure we get our cover plate lined up correctly. You can see the holes down in there, so you can line them up. One of the holes is inside of the centrifugal brake housing. It gets the little concave head machine screw. And I'm not going to completely tighten it until I get the other screw in. So the other screw is down at the bottom. It's the longest machine screw on the reel, and it's kind of in a tight place to get to. Set it in, and they give you this access hole here for your screwdriver. Remember, this is aluminum, an aluminum housing, and small thread machine screws, so do not over tighten them. So now we can begin assembly of our clutch lever, which goes inside of here. Now the clutch lever is going to ride in there like that, and it's got the other shaft, guide shaft, that goes down inside of it right there. Also on the clutch lever, you have these two friction slide plates. The larger one goes on the outside, just like so. The smaller of the two goes on the inside, and it will cover up the guide rod. So you can't put it on until you get the guide rod in. Now this plate is going to want to fall off, so you've kind of got to work with it. So we've got that stuck in. Now we're going to put our guide rod through. Now we can drop our keeper plate on. It can go in place. Then we have a shim. The shim that goes on here is the smaller diameter but thicker copper shim. And then we have our clip, which is one of the two size clips that are identical. Now I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the surfaces here. Now we can begin assembly of our gear train. Now the way this thing works is, this bearing that we put on the spool, it's going to slide up into this housing. This is our clutch disengagement lever. The clutch disengagement lever slides in here and lays in there like that. Now if you look at it, you can see that it's going to contact all along that side. So we're going to grease it all along the contact points. Don't want a ton of grease now. Once again, drop it in place. Rub it around a little bit. Make sure the grease is smeared good on the inside of there. Okay, the next thing we're going to install is our clutch cam. And the way this works is the clutch cam sits in here like this. And it has this protrusion off the bottom that rides in here and catches the clutch lever. So it moves the clutch lever when it rotates. You've got this little brass pin that goes in here that sits down in there, and then you've got this steel pin that comes up through the bottom. And what happens is you take your spring, you've got this spring right here, the spring clips into the brass pin, and you pull tension on the spring and it hooks around the steel hook right there, so that when you spin the clutch, you've got spring tension. But we need to grease the clutch. Also underneath the clutch, this lever right here, this pin dowel is caught by your clutch disengagement mechanism right there. And the clutch disengagement mechanism rides down, it rides down in this void right here, just like that. You've got a spring that it attaches to also in there. So it's going to ride in there. This spring will actually swivel around there, and it attaches in there like so, and it rides in there just like that. So we got to grease all of this before we assemble it. Now the clutch cam, it contacts all around the bottom, and it contacts on the inside, and it contacts up top right here on this inside, and of course the dowels contact, and then you've got contact here and here. So we're basically going to grease this entire thing. But remember, you don't want to over grease it. So the clutch cam is not seeing a whole lot of spinning. It just moves back and forth, so it doesn't need a huge amount of grease. Then I'm going to also daub a little grease on the top of the clutch release lever where it's going to contact. Then I'm going to put some grease on this thing. I'm going to grease it right here because all of this is going to have contact. Doesn't require a lot of grease, it just needs a little grease. This is kind of going to be fiddly to put all this in there. I'm going to start by sitting this thing in where it goes and hooking it to its spring. Okay, now comes the fun part, lining up the clutch cam with both these two holes. I'm going to start with the clutch lever right there, and then I'm going to grab this, pull it a little forwards. There we go. It all popped together now. All that's in place. Now before I put the spring on, since I've got it all in place, before I put the spring on over here, I am going to put the retainer plate down. I'm going to put a little grease on the retainer plate, because even though the retainer plate is solid, the clutch cam still spins on it. Now the retainer plate gets 2 coarse thread plastic screws. And you want to make sure you get them started good, because you don't want to cross thread them. And don't tighten one down until you get the other one in place and started. And don't over tighten. It is a plastic housing. Next, we will drop our little brass sleeve in that our spring on the clutch cam is going to go into. Then we will push our dowel through that the spring attaches to on this side. Take our spring, place it on there like so, place it in the little sleeve, and then we got to hook it. There we go. Okay. Now let's check it again. Now we can start assembling our gear drive. First thing I want to do is I want to put this little gear on. This is the idler gear for the level wind. It simply goes on this brass stud right here. There's no washer for it or anything like that. We're going to put a little grease on this stud. The diagram shows the flat part, the flat side facing up. There's a flat side and a side with holes. It gets the smallest C-clip in the reel. Now we will start our stack up for the gear drive. The gear drive gets this bushing, which goes in this side, and it'll only go in one way because it is flat on one side. I think I'm going to grease it before I put it in. So we're going to let it fall out of there, and we're going to put some grease in it. Now we'll drop it in place. And you're going to have to hold it as you're working, because there's nothing to hold it in until you get the shaft in place. Now that your shaft stack up is one gear, and the shaft has a recess on it and a flat. The flat side goes, the flat part goes toward the shelf. The recess goes toward the clip in. Then you've got a washer that goes on. Now we're going to put a little bit of grease in there on that washer. Then your shaft goes through, and you have to line your little idler gear up with your gear on your shaft. Now you've got a brass washer and your last C-clip. Now you stack up. First thing that goes on is your anti-reverse ratchet. Then you have your small friction washer. Then you've got your gear. Now you can do your friction washer for the inner of the gear, followed by your washer plate. Now I'm going to put my pinion on, and I'm going to do that first by greasing the pinion yoke, and I'm also going to swab some grease on these runners here where the pinion yoke slides up and down on them. Now I'm going to grease the pinion yoke very well, because the pinion yoke is going to see the most rotation. Now I'm going to grease my pinion. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to squirt a little grease inside the pinion from this end, so that when the shaft of the spool goes through, that it will give it a little grease. I'm going to grease the pinion now. Ample grease, not overly greased, but ample amount of grease. Pinion sets into the pinion yoke like that right there. They all sit in together like so. Now let's put a little grease on our main gear. Doesn't require a ton, but I like to put a little grease in every tooth. Now we've got our clutch springs, and they have decided that they're going to go together. Clutch spring slide on. Now we're going to take our sleeve and we're going to install our sleeve onto there like so. I'm going to put a little grease on the inside of this sleeve, even though the sleeve does not rotate. I'm going to put a little grease on the inside for the purposes of corrosion control. And then we're going to grease the outside of the sleeve very well. Now we're going to set this to the side. We're going to install our parts into the cover. Pretty simple on this one. The anti-reverse bearing goes into the cover, slides in place. Doesn't fit very tight. You've got an O-ring on the friction tension adjuster. I did not remove that O-ring when I did this because I do not have a replacement O-ring in case that O-ring would have broken. But we have the bearing, which is also a 3x10x4, and then we have our, it's going to go on. That's all there is. There is a brass tension washer inside of the adjustment knob. It did come out while I was cleaning it, but I put it back in. Okay, let's grease our anti-reverse bearing. Generous grease in the anti-reverse bearing, folks. Now we can assemble the two plates to each other. This hole lines up with this lines up with that, and your two holes here for your screws line up with your clutch spring studs. Now you've got these two screws, which are your long flathead machine screws. Be careful not to cross thread. Now for your assembly to the spool. The spool goes in just like any normal spool. Now we're going to do a little bit of grease inside this hole just to make it easier for that bearing to slide in and out. Now we slide the spool on, or we slide the cover on. In order for this to go together right, two things have got to happen. Your spool's got to line up with your pinion, which it has. And then since it is not in the locked position, you have to make sure that your clutch lever is in the up position when you put it together. And I just discovered that it's actually going to be easier to put the spool in there and then assemble everything together here. Like so. And it pops together. If everything's lined up, it will pop together. Then you've just got thumb screws here. Now we can assemble our drag and install our handle. So the drag's pretty simple. You've got, it's basically our drag adjustment star works basically the same way as any other drag adjustment star. You have concave washers. One goes up, one goes down, pointing towards each other. Then you have your flat washer goes on. So that's one thing I need to say. In the disassembly video, this flat washer was stuck inside the drag star due to old grease and crud. It came out while I was disassembling the reel. Now your drag star, you're going to start it on there. You got to get the threads lined up and then spin it to where you start getting some tension, and then you can hold it with your finger. Now you can also take your handle, drop your handle on, spin your drag star as well. Once you got your drag star in place, spun down far enough, you have your handle washer, and its concaves go down towards the drag star, just like that. Then you've got your handle. Handle sits on, and then your handle nut. Your handle nut has a flat side and a concave side. Concave side goes up. Now you just tighten down your nut. And you've got to get it the right tension so that your keeper plate will line up with the screw hole, and this one is just right. I hit it just right out of pure luck. Now you got your screw. And that is a reassembled Calcutta 250 with modifications to get rid of this plastic washer, plastic bushing on the spool. Let's see how the spool does now. That's much better. It's not as loose as, say, a low profile, but that is much better than it was. Before, it would barely make 2 or 3 revolutions. Okay, so the last things we need to do is we need to grease the level wind. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to just put a little grease in it all the way over. Gently roll it like that. Put a little more grease in. That is the reassembly and greasing of a Calcutta 250. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something from it. And until next time, as always, this is Hyckory Styck with you. Y'all have a good one.